We're so excited to be able to present this part two. In part one, we really spent quite a lot of time going over the steps, the background where this is appropriate technique. And we're really excited to have the opportunity to give you the chance to do some hands-on research with this technique. Well, not research, but some experience, get an idea of how it works in the real world. So we're going to give a really brief reintroduction to template analysis and really focusing on the steps. We'll kind of identify the step that we're going to be practicing today in our activity. And we really want you to think about, as we're going through this, how you could apply these to your own work. Once we've done a little bit of background, we'll move on to a small group exercise where we'll be providing you with some really limited short excerpts of data, so it's not too overwhelming. But then we're going to have you test drive a template and summarize that data just like you would if you were doing this for your own research. After that, we have a few reflection questions that we'd like everybody to share and think about and discuss, and then we'll wrap up. So Grace, do you want to take over and start sharing with everybody the steps in the background?
Sounds good, thank you. So hopefully some of you either attended our first presentation or watched the recording of it. If not, that is totally fine. We're going to go over, like Patrick said, in a little bit of detail what template analysis is and really focus on what we're doing today so that you can have sort of a refamiliarity with it going into the group activity. So briefly, template analysis is one rapid qualitative analysis technique where we use what we call a summary template to help us organize data from interview guide transcripts, focus group transcripts, or other qualitative data. I've seen people use this with observational data or more ethnographic data. Our exercise today is focused on interview data, so that's a lot of the examples I'm giving. And as I talk through it, I usually just use, interview data as the example for this. And templates help us to sort of organize major topics from our interview guides into what we call domains, and then be able to help us look across our data collection events to draw comparisons and to provide essentially a summary of our qualitative work. Next slide. So what is a template? Essentially, it is what we like to call a data reduction tool, and it is something that we will use that we apply to each transcript. So I'll talk through all of this and show you examples, sort of talking through the steps, but just as an overview, we use the template to organize our data from each transcript, and we develop these templates based on broad domains that map to our interview guide or focus group guide. We refine those templates through an iterative process. This is sort of what we're going to focus on today a little bit. But basically, the summary template ends up being sort of a condensed version of not only our transcripts, but also maybe our notes from our interviews, as well as participant info. And it just provides us a really quick and easy way to get a handle on our qualitative data and be able to use that data to sort of actionably move forward. So the process that we present is drawn from Dr. Allison Hamilton. She's a VA researcher, and she sort of created this process, and Patrick and I have used this several times. And so we, present this as, as her work that we will sort of give our spin on and sort of our best practices that we've developed. But it's basically 5 steps, and then we've added a 6th step around synthesizing data at the end. And so I will talk through all of these, but really focusing in on step 3, like Patrick said, taking that summary template for a test drive, because that's what we'll be doing together today. So step 1 is basically the point at which you would start once you've, created your interview guide, maybe even started to do some interviews. So these steps are really focused not so much on an overall qualitative research project and everything that needs to go into it, because there's obviously a lot that needs to go into it in terms of planning your research questions and who you're going to interview and all that. But this really starts at the point at which you're ready to start analyzing your data. And so the first step is to create what we call neutral domain names that correspond with each interview question. So briefly, usually I do this by having a couple of team members take the interview guide and essentially go through and map each interview guide question to a domain name. These domains are usually just brief summaries of the questions, 2 to 4 words, that would easily allow somebody to identify where in a transcript this topic is being discussed. So we've given some examples from the data that we'll be working with today. This first example, the interview guide question was, in your experiences, what are the positive aspects or strengths of the emergency food system before the pandemic? The domain name being strengths in emergency food system. Similarly, the second example, in your experiences, what gaps did you see emerge or get wider? Domain name gaps in emergency food system. So again, these are just very brief overviews of what the question is to allow us to easily identify this topic in an interview guide. Once we have those domain names, that's really the heart of the summary templates. Again, I've included the example from Patrick's work that he used and that we'll sort of talk through today. But you can think of this as, your data collection and organization tool. So we often do these by having the top sort of half be around data on who the interviewer was, some information about the interview that you want to capture, any participant info that you want to capture up here. So for example, Patrick has included age, gender, race, ethnicity. And then you can see the bottom half has the domain names listed in there and a space for example quotes. There are many ways that you can organize these summary templates. Like this one allows you to just type right into a Microsoft Word document. You could organize this as a table if you wanted. This is really personal preference, and some of this will come through your test drive of the template to understand what your team's preferences are. But a few things that I want to highlight are including space to be able to type in whatever your summary information is, and including space to have example quotes. We're going to want to as always in qualitative data analysis and being able to present it, we want to pull out those really rich participant quotes to highlight, what the point that we're trying to make or to be able to include in whatever dissemination products we're using. And so including space for both your summary and the quotes, and then always including sort of that other observations category so that if something comes up in the interviews that doesn't map neatly to one of the sort of pre-specified domains, we have a space to include that in the template and not lose that information in our data reduction. Okay, so step 3, I'm going to spend a little bit more time here because this is, again, sort of where we'll be focusing today. So this is the point at which we have created the summary template. We have some of our interview data done, and we want to start test driving that template to make sure that it is usable and relevant to whatever our project goals are, and revise that template if needed. So on my teams, when we lead this kind of project, we like to have at least 2 people do this test drive process. I will say often we'll have everybody who's interested in doing the actual analysis will take part in this. It would probably become unwieldy if you had, a group of like 10 plus data analysts, but again, you can figure this out with your own team. I don't think that there are too many people that you can do this with. You just might have longer team meetings to sort of try and reconcile everything. But basically, we'll have 2 plus team members take one transcript and use that transcript to fill out the template, and then we'll have a meeting to compare and talk about some of the following. So in addition to summarizing the data, and I'll talk about that in the next slide and sort of what goes into the template, this gives us a chance to assess some other things related to the template that we might want to make sure that we get right at this step before we get into analyzing every single transcript and avoiding the need to go back and, make changes if we decide at the end of the project that actually we really wanted to include something in this template that we didn't do from the beginning. So when you're reviewing the template and looking at it, and you can do some of this today as well, although we've used sort of condensed templates, so it's not going to look, like a full template like I showed on the previous slide. But some of the things that you're going to want to think about are, do the domain names make sense? And do you need to relabel any of the domain names? Essentially, are you able to use those domain names to identify where in the transcript we're trying to pull that information out from? Also, is there any additional information that you want to capture at the top of the template? Maybe, some other things that we include often are language of the participant. If we're talking to people, I do a lot of clinician interviews and health system interviews. I often include things up there like how long a person has been in their position. So essentially, do you have everything up at the top that you want to include? And then also taking keeping track of how long it took everyone. This is partly to, if it's taking an excessive amount of time, you might rethink how well your domain names are labeled, but also giving you an idea of how to move forward with allocating resources for completing the rest of the data analysis and the rest of the templates. So what actually goes in that template? And this is, again, what you'll be pulling out today. So essentially you can think of what goes in the template as you want to be able to capture the major points within each domain. So when you are looking through the interview guide, when you're looking through the interview transcript and you recognize, oh, this person's asking this question now, this maps to this domain. I want to take the respondent's information and capture a really distilled short summary of their answer. If any of you have worked on other types of qualitative data analysis before, this is where rapid qualitative analysis is really going to differ. We are not going through the interview and applying codes in the way that you might be in other situations. We're really just trying to summarize the data to, again, move towards getting that quick summary that can help us towards action-oriented work. I tend to do summaries as bullet points. I think that makes it a little bit easier for people to process. It's easier to, write up. If you want to do your summaries as full sentences, that's also fine. This is slightly, again, a personal preference and maybe a preference of the team that you're working with. But really, depending on the interview guide and topic and how lengthy a person's responses are, this will look a little bit different. But this is not a place to capture every nuance of what a participant said, but really to create a short summary. This is also the time that you want to pull out good quotes. This, is not a time to pull out, create a summary, and then just copy and paste that section of the transcript into the template. We really want to pull out quotes here that we think truly represent a point that we're trying to, capture or are, we think describe something very well. Some of this will take a little practice if you're not used to qualitative work. I think this is a place where when I've worked with teams who are newer to this, misstep that I see at the beginning is just simply copying and pasting an answer instead of thinking about like, is this really a great quote? And not every interview will have great quotes. Sometimes you'll get an interview where somebody says, very to the point, like, this is what I thought, this is what I did. And then sometimes you'll get an interview where you see a quote and you're like, oh, this is much better than I could say in my own words. Again, this takes practice and you'll probably today be looking through the transcript, see some areas where you're like, oh, that's a great quote. And some areas where you're like, yeah, that's fine, but I don't necessarily need to pull it into the template. And we'll give examples of at the end, sort of how we did this. You can see that as well. Something else that goes in the template is noting an absence of data. So for example, if the interview guide or the interviewer asks a question and that respondent says, oh, I don't really have anything to say about that, or, I really can't answer that question, you're going to want to note that too. And you can say simply, respondent had no answer. If an interviewer didn't ask a specific question that is one of the domains, you can say interviewer didn't ask, but you don't want to just lose that data point. You want to be able to retain that. A general rule of thumb, and this is truly a general rule of thumb, template summaries should be about 1 to 2 pages if we are working with maybe like a 30, 45-minute interview, and about 2 to 4 pages if we're working with, an hour plus focus group. This is going to vary significantly, one, depending on how you set up your template, if you're using bullet points versus full sentences. But you think about a 30-minute interview is maybe a 12-ish page transcript. We're condensing that down to just 1 to 2 pages. So really, I think I include this as a guideline because I think it really highlights how much we're reducing the transcript into a very short summary. And this is something that, over time, I know certainly the first templates I did tended to be on the longer side, and over time, you'll sort of get better at summarizing and identifying what really needs to be in it versus what really doesn't need to be in it. So once you have sort of had your team members individually do those templates, do those initial round of summaries, I like to have everybody send me their summaries. I will send it back out to the entire group that we're meeting with. and ask everybody to sort of review their team member summaries before we meet. And then we'll have this meeting where our goal is really to establish consensus in both the breadth and depth of information to be captured. So we'll have a discussion around how similar was the information captured within domains, what quotes were identified, talk about whether we need to make changes to the content or the layout, and then discuss the need to conduct a second round of group summarizing. This doesn't always happen, but more often than not, it does, and we'll do sort of another round of this process and come back together. I will also say this is a place where, depending on the makeup of your team, you'll start to sort of see differences in how people pull things out. I'm working on a project right now where we have both people from my sort of academic institution, and then we have community members, and we've partnered people together to do these templates together. And in our first round of summaries with everybody, we saw some differences in how people pulled information out and the types of information people pulled out. And I think this is very reflective of how, as researchers, as practitioners doing this work, we're always on the lookout for sort of what in our data, what are we seeing that captures our eye? What are we pulling into this? And I think it really gives us a chance to reflect on sort of what is our position to the research, and how are we pulling all of that out. You may in your group activity see significant differences in what you each pull out as a summary, and I think it's interesting to think about how that reflects sort of what your position is in the world and in relation to the work that you're doing. So step 3, that's what we're going to do today. Just briefly, step 4, once you have done all of this and, for your own project and your own team, you can, and you feel like you have consistency between what you're putting in the templates and your test drive is complete, you can divide up those transcripts across the team and have everybody summarize. Generally, I do not have teams double summarize transcripts. I think especially if you do step 3 very rigorously, this is not needed. But depending on your project goals, who is part of the team, how familiar they are, you might decide to do that. It's truly a personal choice. Next slide. And then once all of the transcripts are summarized, you can get into sort of the analysis and synthesis. So step 5, we talk about transferring summaries into a matrix. You can see this table, for example, each column is one of the domains, and then each row is one of the interviews. So you would literally go through your template summaries, copy and paste from those domains directly into these interview boxes. And this allows us to very easily sort of look across how people responded to certain questions and what are some of the differences and similarities across participants and across domains. And then finally, step 6, I like to think of this as sort of synthesize, and depending on what the goals of your project are and what your original research questions are, this might look different. Some of the things, again, this is a point which I often will bring the team of analysts as well as anybody else who sort of has a vested interest in the data. I'll bring everybody back together. We will present some overall findings from the projects, and we'll sort of have this discussion on, what were the commonalities that we're seeing between groups or between interviewees? Where are we starting to see differences? Do we think that there are themes that are emerging across our participants? This is a place, I think, again, to think about what did you think was interesting? As I, will always come into research with our own biases in the background, but sometimes that is very helpful in this process, thinking about, knowing what I know about this topic, what am I seeing in these interviews that is really catching my eye? Thinking about whether you're counting anything, this is a time to do that. For example, I think especially in focus groups, for example, in this focus group, X number of people said this across 4 interviews, participants identified 9 ideas about this. And then this is also a chance to think about how you're presenting the data. So whether you need to create textual summaries, are you trying to create a figure or diagram, identify representative quotes? And I'm not going to get too into this because this is all truly subject to whatever your research goals are. Are you trying to write a research paper? Are you trying to do a report for a community? It's all going to look very different. So we have a chance to pause here for questions. I think what I want to emphasize is we are happy to answer questions about the process. I think any questions about step 3 in particular and how we're doing that, will be the focus, but again, we'll open it up for a few minutes. We've built in plenty of time for questions throughout. And again, that is a very quick overview. If you go back to which we have sent out, our first presentation, we go into all of that a lot more in depth. So we'll just pause for a minute. And feel free, I think, to use the chat for questions would be easiest. And this will not be the only time for questions. So if you think of something later, we'll have time at the end. Maybe we'll give it another minute, and then Patrick, we can move into background. And if you think of something, then feel free to type it into the chat and we'll address it afterwards. So I see Emmy. What would you consider the minimum number of analysts required for this process? I would say that minimum is really 2. You really want to have you and at least another person doing it. I always like when there are more. I've never really tried to do this with a group of more than maybe 4 for sort of the step 3 consensus building part. I think it's doable, but might get a little unwieldy. Patrick, have you done this with larger teams?
So, not with analysts, but I have done it with just 2 analysts, and it's doable, but the way we did it is we had 2 analysts, but we also had community partners who we would check our results with, and we did member checking, so we were actually sending our summaries to the participant. So, there's a lot of opportunities to ensure that you're doing this with rigor and you're not misrepresenting, even if you are limited on kind of that labor capacity in terms of number of analysts. It's also, I think we talked last time, this is a really good technique for bringing in community members and people who are less familiar with qualitative research. This can be an easy introduction. So that's definitely another option to think if you're kind of, stressed about how many people you have working this analysis. So, okay, we're getting questions now. Any type of analysis biases that may play a role while preparing the summary template? I think any type of bias you need to be cognizant of. It's just like with every type of qualitative research, you are interpreting the data and bringing in everything that makes you, including your research role, your personal life, your experiences. Those will all affect how you see things. So I do think that those processes of thinking about reflexivity, maybe journaling, taking notes, how are you feeling? Those are all important things you can do in this process to address those. You're never going to eliminate biases. What you want to do is have multiple perspectives so you can recognize them and account for them and discuss them when you're presenting your results. Grace, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that's a great summary, and I think it's also why I have loved this technique to be able to do with people who have less academic research experience, but more sort of real life experience in some ways, because we all bring in sort of a different context to this, and I just think that this analysis approach has made it far easier for us to work with community members on this kind of research. And I think, we call them biases, and, they certainly are, but a lot of times they're also really positive influences on sort of how we end up interpreting this data. So that's all I would add.
So we have another question about determining data is saturated, no more data emerging from all the domains. So I think that is a good check. Again, if all your summaries, when you put them in the matrix, are telling you the same thing, you can, think of it as saturation. Personally, I don't necessarily know if saturation is the best metric for every time you're going to be using this. I'll kind of explain that more when we get into the background of the data, why saturation really wasn't a concern for the data we're sharing with you. But if that is something you're really hoping to reach and be confident about, I think looking at that matrix and seeing the same summaries from different analysts, hopefully, being reflected, you can assess that just looking at those summaries.
I would just add that I often organize these projects, so we are doing analysis as we are doing data collection. So I usually encourage, if it is possible, to have somebody do the interview and then have somebody fill out the summary template. Obviously, you have like a little lag time in that beginning when you're sort of all trying to do it together, but I'll usually do the first interview, get the transcript, have our team of analysts do the summary, and then move forward. So then as we're going through the interviews, we're sort of having that check on saturation as well so that we can correct at that point rather than waiting until the end when we are looking across our 10 interviews and saying, oh, this like really wasn't enough. So, and I think rapid analysis, because you can do these summary templates so quickly, really lends itself well to that on the spot check around saturation, if that is your concern for your project.
Great. So if you continue having questions as I'm describing uh, our group activity, just put them in the chat. Grace will be keeping an eye on that. We'll also, as we mentioned, have built in plenty of time for other questions. So for today, our goals for the exercise, it's really, I think doing the exercise is really about this main point, gaining experience with the mechanics, that's step 3 of template analysis. Because if you can do step 3, I think you can do all the steps after it. And the steps before it, they're really much more similar to traditional qualitative techniques. So if you're familiar with developing a code book, it's not too different to develop your domains based on your interview questions. These next 2 goals really, I think, are going to emerge from our small group discussion questions and our large group reflection. So being able to describe when you would use this technique and when you would not, and also specifically in your own research or evaluation work, how could you implement this technique? So we did want to give some background on the data we'll be providing you, just so you have some idea where it's coming from. So my research focuses on the emergency food system in rural communities, and my goal is really to better meet the need of older adults. If you're not familiar, the emergency food system includes food banks, food pantries, or food shelves, and those types of organization. And much like with everything else, the pandemic was really a time of massive upheaval, but also necessary adaptation from providers, and also for households that access these resources. And we really wanted to just get a better idea of what had happened during that time. So we conducted interviews with really a lot of different types of folks who interact with rural Minnesota's emergency food system. So this included people at the state level in government and at advocacy organizations, people at food banks, people at food shelves, the kind of day-to-day managers and shoppers. So the saturation question I mentioned, we didn't actually expect to meet saturation when we were talking to all these different folks. We actually expected a lot of variety in their responses. We didn't think that the strengths and challenges of our shoppers were going to be the same as the strengths and challenges as our providers. So for us, saturation wasn't a concern in this specific context, but it's always going to depend what you're looking at. And just again, to kind of give you an idea of one of our research questions, I'd say that because we did have other things we were interested in, but for the purpose of this exercise, we were really focused on what strengths and challenges emerged or changed in the emergency food system during the pandemic. And as you can kind of see, right from our research question, we can really easily identify 2 broad domains, strengths and challenges. So, Grace, can you pop those 2 links in the chat when you get a chance? Perfect. So just why I chose template analysis. The first was my goal was a high-level overview of what happened. I didn't want to know what specific, the nuances in either strengths or challenges, because there just wasn't enough information available. I just wanted to document what was happening, and we also knew those broad domains. Like I said, in the research question, we could really easily see them. And finally, we were a bit time constrained. We wanted results of our first interviews to really quickly inform our later interviews. So when we were talking to the statewide folks, we wanted to be able to ask our providers, were you experiencing the same thing? When we talked to our providers, we wanted to be able to ask from the shopper perspective, did you see this happening in the food shelf? And we also were using this to inform a grant submission. So we wanted to turn around the results fast in order to enable that. So it's actually led to my current project where we're using thematic analysis to get at some of those nuances about what we heard in this rapid qualitative assessment. So I always like to really plug that doing this type of rapid qualitative work doesn't necessarily make you not return to thematic analysis or use it when it's appropriate. So for our exercise, and there's a link in the chat for exercise materials where everything you will need for this is available. It's a Google Drive. Please don't work on the Google Drive. Please download it to your own computer so everybody can access a clean copy of those materials. But we've provided brief edited transcripts from some of these interviews with 3 different types of participants. So one was a government partner, this was transcript 1, a food shelf manager, transcript 2, and a shopper, transcript 3. And we're going to test drive a template using those 2 broad domains on each of these interviews. So each breakout room, we're going to do, I think, 6 breakout room, or let's do 6 breakout rooms, is going to use the transcript corresponding to their breakout room. So room 1 uses transcript room. Room 4 is going to use transcript 1. Room 5, transcript 2. And you're going to summarize both the strengths and the challenges you see in these responses. We want you to try to keep summaries to 2 to 3 sentences or bullet points, whatever you would prefer for each domain. And we'd also like you to try to select a quote that supports your summary. We also have a second link in the chat for different matrices. We have these separated out by breakout room. So after you're done summarizing, we're going to ask you to go in and put your summary and your quotes in these matrices so you can go through the process of having that group discussion where you meet and you look across different responses to see how it's working. We have a question in the chat. To clarify, did you use template analysis first and then secondary analysis and same data approach? So the thematic analysis is different data. We considered doing a thematic analysis on the same data, but I decided the sample size, there was too much variability. We wouldn't be able to draw any conclusions if we had done a thematic analysis. Just the study was set up to provide these broad insights. I didn't think it would be really revealing to do a thematic analysis on that same data. So once everybody has added their summaries to these matrices, we want you to take a few minutes to read the matrix and then discuss these things around process, results, and takeaways. I've included a document in that exercise materials folder that has each of these questions, so you don't need to remember them and hold them in your head. You'll be able to refer back to them as you're in your breakout rooms. In terms of the logistics, we're going to give you about 20 minutes for individual work. I encourage you to, turn off your camera, really spend some time focusing alone, about 5 minutes to read and reflect on the transcript, 15 minutes to summarize, and then place it in the online matrix. When you're done, please turn your camera back on to indicate to your group members that you're ready to share. Once everybody is back, hopefully you'll have read everybody's responses and you're going to be able to have your small group discussion, which we're giving about 10 minutes. So, and again, discuss process, results, and takeaways. We'll give you about a 5-minute warning when we're about to return to a larger group for discussion and wrap up. And we want, if you have questions during this process, either just raise your hand. One of us will join you in your breakout room to answer any questions. Really, if you have questions about the larger process or when to use this technique, I think it would be better to hold those till later. We have plenty of opportunities to discuss those sorts of things. We really want you to spend this 30 minutes on trying to execute this specific task. And the last thing we wanted to do before is just show you a example of a completed matrix from the same study, but from a different transcript. Just to give you an idea, again, a couple bullet points and an example quote. These also might look longer than what you have in your summaries because we really have reduced the transcripts down. Again, they're only 1 or 2 pages of data, whereas we were working with, 16 to 20 page transcripts to answer these same questions. So don't feel like, oh no, I don't have as much information as I thought I would have. It could be really quite small summaries, right to the point. But what you want to do is try to get it into something looking kind of like this.